Section, we get a step closer to the experience. We come, we take off one of these little Russian dolls and get a little bit closer to the actual objective experience that forms the basis for the story. Kurt Lemon, Rat Kiley's friend, dying. So, right away, Kurt Lemon and Rat Kiley started goofing off. They didn't understand about the spookiness. And so we've got this really unusual phrase here that I think is deliberately vague and unsophisticated in linguistic terms to capture the sense that they didn't grasp the terror and are not at this point experiencing the true nature of the terror of war. They were kids, they just didn't know. A nature hike, they thought, not even a war. So there's this contrast here, I think, of their innocence and indifference to the horror of war with the experience that we know that they gained. We know that they gained this because Rat Kiley starts our story off telling us how horrified he is. So this is the state they were. This is where they were before the horrifying incident that caused Rat Kiley to change, that caused him to use all that offensive vernacular and that sort of have that sense of wickedness, blowing up villages and burning them and blowing up fish in the river. This is them before that occurred. So they went off into the shade of some trees, quadruple canopy, no sunlight at all, and they were giggling and calling each other motherfucker and playing a silly game they'd invented. So again, we look at this, and it's deliberately emphasizing their childlike nature, the childlike nature of what they are doing at this point. The game involved smoke grenades, which were harmless unless you did stupid things, and what they did was pull out the pin and stand a few feet apart and play catch under the shade of those huge trees. Whoever chickened out was a motherfucker, and if nobody chickened out, the grenade would make a light popping sound and they'd be covered with smoke, and they'd laugh and dance around and then do it again. If you look at the structure of this sentence, they're not sophisticated sentences joined largely with conjunctions. Whoever chickened out was a motherfucker, and if nobody chickened out, the grenade would make a light popping sound. If they are joined, it's with the word and. The sentence structure is very simple, the diction is childlike. And the game itself, I think, functions as a symbol of their naivety. And then again, we've got this insistence that it's all exactly true, which is this motif of storytelling and its insistence on truth that crops up again. And we wonder whether this is. It sounds entirely authentic, but we wonder whether these are details that O'Brien is manipulating within this narrative to give us this impression of their childlike innocence. It happened nearly 20 years ago, but I still remember that trail junction and the giant trees and a soft dripping sound somewhere beyond the trees. I remember the smell of moss. Up in the canopy there were tiny white blossoms, but no sunlight at all. And I remember the shadows spreading out under the trees where Lemon and Rat Kiley were playing catch with smoke grenades. And so there's this digression again from the actual narrative of the incident into the narrator's recollection of the surroundings. And that sensory imagery that's used here lends this recollection a sense of authenticity. I'm telling you that this is true, and here's all my sensory imagery to prove that it is. Here's all the subjective experience that I recall that proves sort of irrefutably that this experience was a real one. Further down, at one point, Mitchell Sanders turned and looked at me, not quite nodding. Then after a while, he rolled up his yo-yo and moved away. And so we've got this really peaceful scene. There's his friend flipping his yo-yo. They're having a conversation, snoozing. And then those two messing around with a grenade and laughing. It's hard to tell what happened next. And so here, the digression and the metafictional reflection is actually a frank admission of the weakness of the recollection itself. And so again, whether the sensory objective details are true, it is the impact of this experience that is the goal of true war stories. They were just goofing. There was a noise, I suppose, which must have been the detonator. So I glanced behind me and watched Lemon step from the shade into bright sunlight. His face was suddenly brown and shiny. A handsome kid, really. Sharp grey eyes, lean and narrow-waisted, and when he died it was almost beautiful, the way the sunlight came around him, and lifted him up and sucked him high into a tree full of moss and vines and white blossoms. So we look at this, we've got this figurative language of the sunlight being personified, sucking him into a tree full of moss and vines and white blossoms. This floral imagery that I think is supposed to function perhaps as a sort of almost like a graveyard tribute. Again, is emphasizing the subjective truth of the vision of tragic beauty here. We're seeing something almost beautiful because of its wickedly tragic nature. We're looking at this through the lens of a tragic narrative. So accidental, so stupid, and so tragic in its severe outcome. But the figurative language here is to give us a sense of this utterly awful incident in a way that makes it deliberately seem sort of aesthetically beautiful. And again, that's a way of meddling with our understanding of binaries. Is this horrifying experience something that's awful? Well, no, and it's confusing, and that's something that he, again, reflects on explicitly later on. That war is both horrifying, but also beautiful. And it's another one of those simple, clear, moralistic binaries that can't be trusted. Then we move into more metafictional reflection. In any war story, but especially a true one, it's difficult to separate what happened from what seemed to happen. What seems to happen becomes its own happening and has to be told that way. The angles of vision are skewed. So this is a metafictional account of the above. That he acknowledges the limitation of his memory and then has to tell the story in a way that matches with his own, what he calls, the way that it seemed to happen. And so here, it emphasizes the subjective truth of the story above, which is indirectly emphasized by that figurative language. That the emotional experience of the tragic beauty of seeing someone accidentally blow themselves to pieces is the thing that Tim O'Brien is trying to evoke, and then tell us that he's trying to evoke afterwards. But that is in order for us to have a confused sense of whether that original experience is exactly as it is described here. When a guy dies like Lemon, you look away and then look back for a moment and then look away again. And so again, the unbearable nature of vision, the unbearable nature of this horrifying incident is the literal cause of objective unreliability in war. Things like this incident. This is not some wishy-washy abstraction. A man accidentally blowing himself up with a hand grenade whilst playing a stupid game with his friend from 18, 19 years old. He's a couple of years older than you guys. Is an unbearably tragic thing to see. And the willingness to look at that or looking away from that horrifying vision is the reason why objective facts are unreliable. We can't quite handle it. We can't quite handle it with the mental apparatus that we have, with the mental and emotional apparatus that we have. It goes beyond the resources that we have mentally to make sense of it. And that is why, then, there is this pressing need for an emphasis on subjective truth of the recollection itself and of storytelling more generally. Pictures get jumbled, you tend to miss a lot, and then afterwards, when you go to tell about it, there is always that surreal seemingness, which makes the story seem untrue, but which in fact represents the hard and exact truth as it seemed. So the playing around with seemingness and truth here is supposed to emphasize that the surreal impression of an incident like that is the truth itself. It's not what the actual experience happened, what experience actually happened and the factual content of it. It is the surreal impression registered by human consciousness that is the material of a true war story, and that is what he is attempting to evoke in the style of this particular story. In many cases, a true war story cannot be believed. If you believe it, be skeptical. It's a question of credibility. Often the crazy stuff is true and normal stuff isn't, because the normal stuff is necessary to make you believe the truly incredible craziness. So this digression here leaps all over the place in logic, but articulates the idea that the believable elements are only present to ensure that what seems crazy is believed. The crazy stuff is the real stuff, and the normal, boring, sort of everyday parts of the stories are the bits that are actually probably false. And so we have this insistence that the experience is so bizarre that actually the details that get changed are usually the everyday parts. They're usually the mundane features, probably the bits in his story about Kurt Lemon being blown up about them all sitting around with their yo-yos or just sitting around doing nothing. That moment could quite easily be manipulated. And it's there not only to make you believe the surreal image of him blowing himself up with a hand grenade, but also then to create the sense of atmosphere that is disrupted, the sense of tranquility that is destroyed by the hand grenade going off and this tragic image of him being blown upwards into the air. In other cases, you can't even tell a true war story. Sometimes it's just beyond telling. And so here, there's a pun on the word tell, I think. You can't tell if a war story is true. You can't register whether it's true. Sometimes it's just beyond telling. It's beyond recognition. It's beyond identification, but it's also beyond the experience of being able to communicate it. And again, the pun in that word blurs the boundaries between true and false because it blurs what this word is referring to in our minds. Is it telling us about telling, the act of explaining or recollecting, or is it telling us about being able to identify, being able to distinguish, to tell what the story is about? I heard this one, for example, from Mitchell Sanders. It was near dusk, and we were sitting at my foxhole along a wide, muddy river north of Quang Ngai. So we've got here another character being introduced to the story, and it's Mitchell Sanders. He, in the things they carried, is a raconteur-like figure, a person who is particularly prone to telling stories and who is obsessed with finding the truth and the morality of those stories. So he is, in some ways, often a kind of a proxy for O'Brien himself. Even though he is a real man, he takes on in the story some of that narrative function that O'Brien, I think, believes that he's fulfilling by writing the text. I remember how peaceful the twilight was. A deep pinkish red spilled out on the river, which moved without sound, and in the morning we would cross the river and march west into the mountains. So again, the sort of beautiful, evocative sensory imagery that finds its way into this story in the midst of all of this sort of chaotic, jargon-filled, anecdotal recollection is a way of providing testimony for authenticity. I remember this experience because here's how you know I'm telling the truth, because I'm trying to evoke it with authentic sensory imagery. The occasion was right for a good story. And so it's not so much that the authentic experience is accurate because of what he's described, but because the experience of our surroundings at that moment in time fits the occasion for storytelling. So it's a question of atmosphere at that point. God's truth, Mitchell Sanders said. And this is where he explains the story. A 6-man patrol goes up into the mountains on a basic listening post operation. The idea is to spend a week up there, just lie low and listen for enemy movement. They've got a radio along, so if they hear anything suspicious, anything, they're supposed to call in artillery or gunships, whatever it takes, otherwise they keep strict field discipline. Absolute silence, they just listen. He glanced at me to make sure I had the scenario. And so here, Mitchell Sanders is capturing the conditions for his story. He is deliberately playing the role of a raconteur in this particular recollection. And so we're trying to work out whether this story is true or not. But the evocative quality of this story, I think, is highly likely to have its basis in objective truth. We're talking hard-ass LP. These 6 guys don't say boo for a solid week. They don't got tongues, all ears. Right, I said. Understand me? Invisible. Sanders nodded. Affirm, he said. Invisible. So again, we've got this military jargon. LP is listening patrol. And affirm, obviously, is a military verb that you would use to confirm your understanding. Invisible. So what happens is these guys get themselves deep in the bush, all camouflaged up, and they lie down and wait, and that's all they do. Nothing else. They lie there for 7 days and just listen. And man, I'll tell you, it's spooky. This is mountains. You don't know how spooky till you've been there. Jungle, sort of. except it's way up in the clouds and there's always this fog like rain, except it's not raining. Everything's all wet and swirly and tangled and you can't see jack and you can't find your own peck to piss with. Like you don't even have a body. Serious spooky. You just go with the vapors. The fog sort of takes you in. And the sounds, man, the sounds carry forever. You hear shit nobody should hear. So if you think of the descriptions here, this is exactly what O'Brien is attempting to make a claim for in this story. This is, this is not good writing in writing 101 technical description. It's not, it's not writing like this. This is not O'Brien writing. I remember how peaceful the twilight was. A deep pinkish red spilled out on the river, which moved without sound. That image is a really powerful piece of description. This is just anecdotal storytelling, but the concept that he's trying to evoke here, I think, is very successfully evoked through the lens of his own subjective recollection of the experience. A very creepy, enigmatic, intangible sense of horror and fear that is created by this lonely, unusual atmosphere that these guys find themselves in. Importantly, unable to communicate with each other. They are unable to talk, and that is what renders the experience so traumatic. And so we can see then why we have in this story stories inside of stories, inside of stories, inside of stories. Because those chains of storytelling are what allow people to survive in the end. They allow people to cathartically express whatever it is that is on their mind that usually is wildly traumatic in these types of situations. Sanders was quiet for a second, just working the yo-yo, then he smiled at me. So after a couple of days, the guy started hearing this real soft stuff, kind of whacked out music. And so here, he's appreciating the effect of his storytelling. And it's a way of connecting an audience with his experience. He's looking here, creating a sense of quiet, working the yo-yo, and then smiles. So after a couple of days, the guys start hearing this soft kind of whacked out music, weird echoes and stuff, like a radio or something, but it's not a radio. It's this strange goop music that comes right out of the rocks, far away sort of, but right up close too. They try to ignore it, but it's a listening post, right? So they listen. And every night they keep hearing this crazy ass goop concert. This is the crazy stuff that he is reflecting on earlier on in the story when he says, that it possesses the surreal seemingness, and that the crazy stuff is true and the normal stuff isn't, because it's what you put in there to make people believe the craziness. And so we've got this already from that metafictional digression, the sense that this crazy business here is what is subjectively true, and it evokes the experience of paranoia and insanity. That's the key detail that we need to take from this, that these unusual experiences create the sense of paranoia and insanity. And in that state, you can't tell whether something is real or not. And so this is some of that crazy stuff that needs some of the normal everyday kind of thing to be woven into it in order to be believed. But look at the language that's used here. There's loads of hesitancy, retractions, colloquial expressions that only give you a vague sense of the actual objective nature of what's being spoken about in this story. But what we do know is how this made him feel. All kinds of chimes and xylophones. I mean, this is wilderness. No way, it can't be real. But there is, like, the mountains are tuned into radio fucking Hanoi. Naturally, they get nervous. One guy sticks juicy fruit in his ears. Another guy almost flips. Thing is, though, they can't report music. They can't get on the horn and call back to base and say, hey, listen, we need some firepower. We've got to blow away this weirdo goop rock band. They can't do that. It wouldn't go down. So they lie there in the fog and keep their mouths shut. And what makes it extra bad, see, is the poor dudes can't horse around like normal, can't joke it away, can't even talk to each other, except maybe in whispers. And all hush-hush, all that just revs up the willies. All they do is listen. This means makes the paranoia and the sense of being spooked even more intense. So importantly here, the experience is extremely bizarre and surreal, but the motif of storytelling resurfaces here because it's actually blocked. The men are not given the opportunity to tell narratives to make sense of this experience. And so the possibility is prevented. And this is, in the end, what necessitates the story that Mitchell Sanders is telling. So the fact that he is telling the stories because something awful happens as a result of this, but the fact that something awful happened as a result of this is because they weren't able to tell stories. And this is where the insistence on the value of communicating the subjective nature of an experience that is horrifying and beyond our normal ability to make sense of is absolutely and crucially vital, not only just to prevent people from going insane and developing post-traumatic stress disorder, but from preventing tragedies occurring, like the one that is about to be told. So, again, there was some silence as Mitchell Sanders looked out on the river. The dark was coming on hard now, and off to the west I could see the mountains rising in silhouette, all the mysteries and unknowns. This next part, Sanders said quietly, you won't believe. Probably not. And you won't. And you know why? Why? He gave me a tired smile. Because it happened. Because every word is absolutely dead on true. So again, the unbelievable is what's true here. The craziness is what's true. And again, there is an awareness on the part of the storyteller that the truth itself is what's going to be difficult for people to make sense of. Sanders made a little sound in his throat like a sigh, as if to say he didn't care if I believed it or not. But he did care. He wanted me to believe I could tell. He seemed sad in a way. And so again, this is another metafictional digression, I think, that reflects on the relationship between the teller of the story and the listener, and emphasizes the importance of him successfully communicating the subjective truth of the experience. He did care. He wanted me to believe. And so they begin the experience, which we'll see in the next video.